really tough and they're really rough and nothing's working, but there's something inside of you that says, I just have to follow that because you don't know who you're going to meet.
Welcome to the Binge on Self-Love podcast. My name is Anna, but you can call me Anci, and thank you so much for tuning in. Binge on Self-Love podcast is about navigating binge eating disorder struggles, disordered eating, and negative body image. Although I share my personal experience with having a negative body image, eating disorders, and I do uncover bits of my personal story, this podcast is not as much about me as it is about you. Beautiful human beings who struggle, who fight, who grow, and who evolve every single day. This podcast is for anyone who wants to feel supported on their recovery journey and simply for anyone who's trying to improve their relationship with themselves. I believe together we can turn something so negative, such as binge eating, into something more positive and hopefully go from binging on food and self-hatred to binging on self-love. Subscribe to the Binge on Self-Love podcast on your favorite platform and tune in every Tuesday for a new episode.
But there's something inside of you that says, I just have to follow that because you don't know who you're going to meet.
Disclaimer: Binge on Self-Love podcast is intended for informational purposes only. It doesn't provide professional medical advice and it is not a substitute for diagnosis or treatment. In this podcast, we cover the topic of eating disorders, so if you find this topic triggering, it may be better for you not to listen to this podcast. Always make sure to put your mental health first. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Binge on Self-Love podcast. My name is Anna, but you can call me Anci. I'm your host, and I am here with another episode. I've recently realized how important honesty is in the recovery process, and not just in the recovery itself, but also on our way to a better self, on our self-improvement journey, and how big of a part it plays when we want to change something. In this episode, I would like to elaborate a bit on why do I think honesty is one of the keys to recovery and to self-improvement, or however you want to call it, and why do I think it holds such a power. So now, without further ado, let's get into it. Why honesty is the key. I started experiencing occasional binge sessions almost 10 years ago. At that time, they weren't that frequent. I would say maybe once or twice every couple of weeks. But as the time went by, they occurred more and more often until I've reached a point when I was fully consumed by the binge eating disorder and I was binging every single day, even multiple times a day. Speaking about it now with the passage of time, it may seem like I knew exactly what was going on, but the truth is that I didn't. I had no idea. I didn't know anything like binge eating disorder even existed. I thought I was just crazy and that there was something very wrong with me. But even when I did figure out that there is an actual name for it and that I do struggle with something called binge eating disorder, it took me another few years to fully admit it to myself and to be honest with myself, and to admit to myself that I have a serious problem. What I'm trying to say is that knowing something's not right is one thing, but being honest with yourself and really admitting to yourself, okay, this is what's going on, I have a problem and I need to do something about it, is a whole nother thing. I haven't started the recovery until like 5 or 6 years later after I experienced the first binge episodes. During those years, I knew something was wrong. I knew that I couldn't live like this forever. And I knew eventually I would have to do something about it and face the problems. But it was really hard to be honest with myself. I have this theory which can be completely false. It's just something I've been thinking about lately. And that's when certain facts or situations in our lives are difficult for us, we create this narrative around it, which makes everything a little easier for us to digest. For example, I knew that it wasn't okay if I was binging so much. I knew it's probably not right to feel so depressed and disgusted with myself all the time. I knew it's not right to spend every penny on food. I knew it wasn't right to lie to everyone around me. But it was a pill that was too hard to swallow for me. It was too embarrassing and too difficult to admit to myself that I probably won't handle this on my own and that I may need a professional help. I also didn't want to admit to myself that I let myself to get to this stage. I didn't want to be honest with myself when it comes to how much I was binging and that I did indeed wasted all my money on food and that I did feel so alone because I haven't told anybody about it and I was just pushing everyone around me away. I think the following behavior is kind of typical for addiction when you try to almost bottle up the reality and the seriousness of the situation and you look away from the problems and pretend they don't exist. I've done that by telling myself, so what, so I just like to eat a lot, or so what, everyone has a skeleton in their closet. Or another thing I've done is that I chose not to look at my bank account for like literally months because I was so terrified to face the reality and I told myself that I didn't know where the money went. Sure, I did spend a lot of them on food, but all of them, there's no chance. And as you can see, I created this narrative that made things a little easier for me to face, but I wasn't honest with myself. The hardest thing for me personally to admit was that I couldn't control what happened to me. I developed binge eating disorder because XYZ, but the way I react to it and the way I handle the problem, whether I do admit it to myself that I have a problem and get some help, or whether I will continue to lie to myself that it's okay and that it's just a phase that will pass and that I am in control of the situation, that decision was just up to me. And whichever option I chose, that was my responsibility. When I chose to say no to the recovery, when I said no to getting help, that was my decision and my responsibility. And when I chose to be fully honest with myself, admit to myself that this issue was way beyond my power and I needed someone to help me, that was also my decision and my responsibility. And some recent issues that we've been dealing with within our family circle made me realize that unless we become 100% honest with ourselves, we can't expect things to change for the better. The truth is, you don't have to be honest with anybody else. You don't have to confess or confide in anyone else if you don't want to, but the one person you have to be honest with, by all means, no matter how hard it is you. And it is a hard and uncomfortable feeling to accept that maybe you screwed up some things and maybe you're not as in control of a situation as you thought you were. But without being honest, you're denying yourself a chance to improve and a chance to get better. Once I started being honest with myself and I admitted to myself that I have a serious problem, and that I do binge this often, that binge eating disorder does affect these areas of my life, and that I can't live a fulfilled life with the eating disorder consuming my mind, that's when things really could start to change. It almost felt like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders because there were no more skeletons in the closet, and by being honest with yourself, I think you're making one of those first huge steps on the journey to recovery. And by being honest with yourself, I think you are making one of those first huge steps on the journey to recovery, to positive change, and to any kind of self-improvement. I really want to highlight that honesty is not about blaming everything on yourself and loathing and being angry with yourself, not at all. I would say it's about seeing things as they are without judging yourself. And from that point, you can choose what you want to do about it. And also, to set the record straight, I don't think or believe that developing an eating disorder, an addiction, or any other problem is our fault. Of course not. We develop it for X amount of reasons and circumstances. But I think that whether we choose to remain in that situation once we realize we have a problem, or whether we decide to get help or to do something about it, that is our responsibility. This honesty policy doesn't apply just to the recovery, whether that's an addiction recovery or an eating disorder recovery, but to anything in our lives that we want to change. I feel like by being honest with yourself, you're accepting a certain responsibility for yourself and for things in your life. And even though at first it may seem like it's a bad thing and that you're going against yourself, it's actually giving you so much power to change things in your life that don't make you happy. About a year ago, I felt really unhappy in certain areas of my life, and I used to blame others for that, other people, other things, external circumstances. And I did it for a while, but nothing really seemed to change. And to be fair, it's always easier to blame something or someone else for my unhappiness than being honest with myself and admitting that I have my fair share of fault for my unhappiness. Again, we don't always get to choose the circumstances we find ourselves in, but we do get to decide how we react to them. So if I didn't feel fulfilled in my work life or my personal life, I could continue to blame my job or my partner or the city I was living in for being too small and for not providing me with enough opportunities or whatever. Or I could be honest with myself and admit to myself that I choose not to be happy by doing the same things over and over again and expecting a different outcome. It may seem like an obvious thing, but at the same time it's not. This is a really stupid example, but it's also a great demonstration of how much we blame other things and people for our dissatisfaction. The following example is really stupid, but it's also a great demonstration of how much we blame other things and other people for our dissatisfaction. A few years ago, I wanted to get into running. I loved the idea of it. I wanted to take on some new hobby, and I knew that when I did go for a run, it was a really great way how to clear my mind. But I find it really difficult to do it and to do it consistently. I used to blame the weather, the season of the year. I used to blame my mood for not feeling like it. I even used to blame my partner for being able to go to the gym while I was struggling to commit to running. I always found a reason why not to go, and I also felt like it was never my fault. And it continued to be like that for another few years until I finally admitted that the only reason why I wasn't really able to commit to running was myself. I hated the discomfort, I hated it wasn't easy, I hated the fact that I wasn't good at it, so I always found a reason why not to go. And from that on, I was finally able to start running regularly. And of course, there were times where I didn't go, but I was at least honest with myself and I took responsibility for those times when it was my decision that I didn't want to go for a run. And I was also able to differentiate when it really was just because of some external circumstances, such as when I was sick or when I had to work late or when I had some other more important things that I needed to tackle that day. It may seem like a really small thing, but it really made the difference between being unhappy for not doing what you want to do and feeling like none of it is under your control, and between taking responsibility for yourself and at least embarking on that journey of change. Once again, I want to highlight that I am not saying that an eating disorder, an addiction, a problem, or whatever is your fault. Not at all. It's not your fault. I feel like once you realize that you have a problem, I think you are the one who's in power to decide, I want to change this, I want to be happy, I want to recover, I want to do this differently, or whether you choose to remain in that situation. I'll hope you leave this episode with some positive inspiration and maybe a motivation to be more honest with yourself when it comes to both the good things happening in your life as well as the problems that you may be facing right now. Either way, remember that you are enough and that by being honest with yourself, you're not making yourself weaker or a less amazing person that you are. But quite the contrary, by being honest with yourself, you're opening doors for a chance to change things in your life for the better. I would love to know if you enjoyed this episode and whether you like this topic. If you're listening on Spotify, you can vote in a poll under the show notes of this episode, or you can rate and review this podcast on your favorite podcasting platform. I'll be back next Tuesday with another episode. Until then, take care, have a great rest of the week, and talk to you soon. Bye!
You have to be your biggest fan. And when things are really tough and they're really rough and nothing's working, but there's something inside of you that says, I just have to follow that.